Last Sunday, we listened to a Norwegian explorer, Alexander Game, shriek with joy, and we reflected on this thing we call delight. And we saw that delight is about a lot more than just pleasure or feeling happy. It is, to quote Ronald Rolheiser, the primary religious virtue and the deepest root of all love, friendship, sexuality, family life, community, passion, and enthusiasm. Delight is the stuff of life. It's what we're created for, what we're designed for. It feeds and holds and supports everything that is most important in life. Which then immediately begs the question, where we ended last week, if creation is full of this goodness and beauty, if people are designed to delight both in creation and in our Creator, then why does delight seem so rare? Like, why aren't we walking around shrieking with joy over things? More to the point, why aren't you and I experiencing delight if we know that God loves us, if we know that we're created for this, if it's all around us, why aren't we tapping into this more? And that's what I want. I mean, isn't that what you want? So I was this past week was reading in John 15, 16, 17. It's called the Upper Room Discourse. It's the night before Jesus is going to go to the cross. And you know what comes up again and again and again in that passage? Joy. Like before Jesus goes to the cross, the thing he wants to talk to his disciples about, to you and me, is joy. He wants us to hear about his joy so that our joy can be complete, is his language. Or you go to the book of Philippians, the Apostle Paul writes this letter to the church in Philippi from prison, and he doesn't know, he says he doesn't know whether he's going to live or die. He doesn't know whether he's going to make it out of there alive. And yet, what does he say again and again? Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I tell you, rejoice. Like I hear that and I want that joy that this world can't crush, that this world can't take away, that can't be lost. This joy that has nothing to do with your circumstances, this joy that could lead Jesus to sacrifice and suffer everything for the joy set before him. But if I'm honest, and I hope to be, this isn't often my experience. And I'm guessing it's not yours either. So that's what I want to talk about today. Why not? Why aren't we delighting in life the way we're supposed to be? Or to be more precise, let me lead this out very, very clearly here. If creation itself is bursting with goodness and beauty, it is, to quote the Hebrew, tov, tov, good, good. And if you and I are made in the image of a God who delights, and the God who says, it's good, it's good, it's good, and we're designed to revel in delight the way God does, and if in Jesus, God actually came after us to show us what fullness of joy looks like and to lead us into fullness of joy. If all of this is true, as the scripture says, then why is our delight so weak, so fickle, so short-lived, and so rare? So there's an image I want to start with today, and it kind of to set things up and help frame out this question. In 1901, Clark University up in Massachusetts, there was an experiment done on the question, can fish learn? All right? Can a walleye learn from past experience? That's the question these researchers were asking. So they placed these walleye in an aquarium, a tank, with some minnows, and the walleye do what walleye do with minnows. They immediately go over and devour them. All right? No surprise there. But then the researchers do something tricky. They take a wall of glass and put it in the aquarium, completely invisible to the walleye, and then they drop minnows in on the one side, and the walleye, what do? No surprise. They ram themselves into the glass again and again and again, trying to get the minnows, but alas, they can't get it. Eventually, the walleye give up, so what they do is they drop some angle worms on this side, the walleye eat them, and this happens on day 2, and day 3, and day 4, and so on. And then one day, the researchers remove the glass from the aquarium, from the tank, but they also stop feeding them worms. This time they drop the minnows in. There's no glass wall there. But now the walleyes, they've learned they can't get to the minnows. So rather than chase after the minnows, they've learned their lesson. Chasing my desires means pain. It hurts too much. It's hopeless. So they swim right up to the minnows, but you see them, they actually turn away as though the invisible wall is still there. They never actually eat the wallows, the minnows. They actually give up. They won't even try. And here's the thing. At the end of the experiment, the walleye, they actually die of starvation surrounded by minnows. And that is what this feels like. Like we're starving for delight, for beauty, for goodness, for connection, for intimacy, for belonging, for love, for joy, and it's all around us. We're invited to it, right there for us to take. So the question that I want to frame this out for is, then why are we starving for these things? Why are we starving for delight? What invisible walls are keeping us from moving ahead, from chasing after it, from seizing it, from enjoying the delight that God has called us to? So, before we dive into our text today, I want to define success here. Let me say that there are about 7 billion answers to the question we're asking. There's one for every person on the face of this planet. My point in this is to say that your brokenness is particular to you. It's yours and not mine. So we might share common themes today, things that all of us can kind of relate to, but what's holding you back from delight is unique to you. It's unique to your story, to your family, to your history, to your hurt, to your personality, to your influences, to your body chemistry and your genetics. It's yours. So let's set up the target today. Today, success is not that you understand why other people are missing out on delight in their life. It's not that. Success is that you understand why you struggle to experience delight, and then you start doing something about it. That you understand why you are missing out on this. Do you recognize the invisible walls that are holding you back? That's the question for today. And what are you going to do about it? All right, with that, our text for today is Matthew chapter 26. Matthew 26, starting in verse 6. Quite by accident, I have 3 points today, and they all happen to start with the letter P, so I feel like a real preacher today. I'm pretty excited about that. But enough of that. Let's dive into the text. Let me set this up here. We're going to be in Matthew 26, starting in verse 6. The context is this. It's Thursday night. Thursday day, actually. In just a few hours, Jesus is going to be arrested, betrayed, handed over, falsely accused, beaten with a cat of 9 tails, and then the next day will be crucified. It's that Thursday. On Friday, he's going to die on the cross. So on that Thursday, we read this, starting in verse 6. While Jesus was in Bethany, in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. So in the first century, very expensive perfumes were kept in, and they were sealed in this alabaster jar, which is like this white, soft stone, but they would be permanently sealed to be saved. For this woman to open it, she would have to literally break the jar so that she could pour it out on Jesus. Once that seal was broken, it was all going to be used up. There was no saving it. There was no preserving it. This was an enormous expense for one special moment only. And from the perspective of the disciples, this is beyond extravagant. This is so stupidly expensive. It breaks their categories. It doesn't even make sense to them. Look at verse 8. When the disciples saw this, they were indignant. Why this waste, they asked. This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor. So, here's the question. How can you possibly justify blowing this much money? Remember, this is an impoverished world. This is like working class people. These people are all poor. Jesus is poor. The world around them is desperate. It's burning down. It's suffering all around them. And she has enough money to own this very expensive perfume. Therefore, she has the power. She could have sold that. She could have alleviated suffering of many. So to just pour this out in one moment, it feels short-sighted. It feels wasteful. Verse 10. Aware of this, Jesus said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She's done a beautiful thing to me. The poor will always have the poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Truly, I tell you, whenever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Jesus says she's done something beautiful, and I will never, ever forget it, and neither should you. So drink this in. Something just happened. A woman breaks open this alabaster jar, pours out this expensive perfume. Everyone sees the exact same thing. This woman breaks open an alabaster jar, pours out this expensive perfume, but not everyone sees the same thing. Jesus sees it and says, "That is beautiful, and I will never, ever forget it." And the disciples see it, and they are indignant. They say, "Why this waste?" Jesus sees it, and he delights in it. They see it, and they are disgusted and outraged. The exact same thing, totally different responses. Now, isn't that interesting? Like, what's going on here? Why did the disciples miss out on the beauty of this moment, on this opportunity for delight? Why did they miss this? So, have you ever seen this picture before? It is, it's one of these trick pictures that actually has two pictures in one. Some people see it, and they immediately see a beautiful woman. That's what I see initially. She's got her head turned, and she's looking to the side. She's wearing a big fancy hat and, like, I don't know, something fancy. But others see this exact same picture, and within that exact same picture, they see an old, haggardly woman who's bent over, who's got this big covering over her head, and a big giant mouth and a big giant nose. So two people could legitimately look at this exact same picture, and one could describe it as ugly and haunting and gross. And the other person could describe it as beautiful and fancy and exotic. And they're looking at the same picture. Exact same thing, but an entirely different perspective. So, if you've ever read or heard or studied optics, eyesight, you know that what comes into the eye is only a small part of what we actually see. So, you have this little diagram here. There's an object out there. The light comes into our eye. But this is only part of the thing. It turns the object and it goes on your retina. But then it goes into your brain, into your mind. And your brain has to translate it, has to order it. And then you come up with a thing. So you look out. This light comes into the eye. This object comes in. Your brain then interprets it and says tree, right? That's how it's supposed to work. But if you've actually studied it at any length, you realize that your brain spends a lot of time guessing and making up things that you may or may not actually see. That the light that comes in your eye only explains a little bit of what we actually call seeing. The reality is that the light that enters into your eye is only just this little part. So I have a friend in Dallas who about 10, 12 years ago, lost part of his eyesight, but it happened in this weird way. The back of his retina, parts of it, died. It was terrible. And so he would just have these spots in his sight that would just be gone. They would just disappear. Now, the weird thing about this, though, is that within a few weeks, he didn't notice the blind spots anymore. They disappeared. His mind, even though he literally could not see at that point, his mind would fill in the gaps automatically for him. His mind would translate it, would tell him what was there. And so from his perspective, he didn't have any blind spots, even though objectively he had blind spots. Here's my point. What happens in your mind is just as important as the light that comes in your eye. How you see in life is as much a matter of perspective as it is reality. So, here's a picture. Some look at this and they see a pale blue dot hurling through the void, vast, empty, scary. And some look at this picture and they see earth, they see home, they see tov, a good creation. Some look at people, this big crowd of people, and they see social animals. They see the third chimpanzee. They see just something that came by chance out of evolution. And others look at the same picture, and they see the image of God over and over and over again. Some see marriage, and they look at this as just a social construct that reinforces gender biases, and others see it as two becoming one flesh, as a God-given institution that reflects the very self-giving and committed love within the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Exact same pictures, vastly different readings. Exact same data, wildly different implications and ways of approaching life. So, when the disciples saw this, when they see this woman do this thing, they were indignant. Why this waste, they asked. The disciples view this act that this woman's doing through the lens, through the perspective of economics, through the lens of the suffering around them, through a pragmatic perspective. And from their perspective, they're right. This is a waste. I mean, from the perspective of how does pouring out this expensive perfume on Jesus, how does that help alleviate suffering around us? It doesn't. And if the question is utilitarian, what would most reduce suffering for the most people, then this woman is terribly wrong, and this is a horrible waste. That if you view life from a perspective of efficiency, and pragmatism, and productivity, and economic value, and reducing suffering. Notice all of those are good things, not bad things. But if you view life only through those lenses, if that's the primary way that you view life, then it will undermine our ability to delight in the most important things. Here's what I mean. It is hard to determine the economic value or the pragmatic value or the utilitarian value of throwing the football with my son in the backyard, of going on a long, unhurried walk with my wife, of enjoying a sunset, or worshiping my God. Now, we live in such an efficiency-obsessed, economy-worshiping culture that I'm sure that people have tried to create some economic value for these things, but it's really, really tough. I might say it's really, really wrong to put a price tag on things like love, intimacy, connection, worship, and delight. You just can't. So the moment you put a price tag on love, intimacy, connection, worship, delight, the moment you put a price tag on delight, you prostitute it. And I use that word intentionally because in this text, in the first century culture, when this woman comes up and intimately pours out this expensive perfume on Jesus' head, if we don't view it from a perspective of worship and love, if we view it through an economic lens, then she doesn't look like a worshiper. She looks like a prostitute right there. It doesn't just drain out the beauty, it makes it ugly. It ruins it. It defiles it. And this is the first invisible wall, the first invisible barrier that we run into when we come to delight. It's our perspective. It's the perspective that we're coming from. And here's the question: where do you inform your perspective? What shapes your perspective on life? So, when we allow our jobs, our parents, social media, the economy, whatever the American culture tells us to, when we allow that to shape our perspective, it not only changes our view of delight, I would suggest that it ruins our ability to delight in the most important things in life. If you have any question about this, I've got a test for you, okay? So this week, I want you to intentionally try, to stay up to date with everything that's happening on social media and everything in the news cycle. Just those two things, right? I want you to turn on every notification on your phone, and every time that little light appears, I want you to pull it out and look at it. I want you to check it when you're bored, and when you go to the bathroom, and when you first get up in the morning, and right before you go to bed at night, and every time in between. Anytime there's a pause, I want you to check it. And then at the end of the week, after following just 1 week of following the news cycle, following social media that closely, I want you to then ask your soul, how are you, oh my soul? How are you doing? How does this perspective that's given to me from the news cycle and from social media, does it help me chase and seize and enjoy and delight in the things of God? Or does it lead to increased anxiety, depression, fear, apathy, outrage, and boredom? I'm guessing you know where I'm leading with this. So here's the question. And I can't answer this. This is just for you and God and maybe someone who's really close to you. Here's the question. What would it look like for you to seek God's perspective in your daily life this week? Like what little habits, instead of checking social media, instead of turning on all the notifications, instead of following the news, instead of reading it first thing in the morning, last thing at night, every time you're bored, when you go to the bathroom, instead of doing that, what little habits would actually help form your perspective so that you value the things of God, the things that you already know are most important? What little habits of prayer, of pausing, of listening, of reading, of journaling, of exercising? I don't know what it is for you, but what little habits would reset your perspective this week, will give you a bigger perspective, will give you a perspective that increases your capacity to love, for love and intimacy, connection, worship, and delight, as opposed to decreasing them? That's the first question. So the first invisible wall is our perspective. And the question is instead of doing the things that we know are going to shrink it and narrow it and focus on the wrong things, how do we increase our perspective and our capacity for the things of God? The second priority, the second invisible wall I want to talk about is priorities. And this goes back to verse 8 again. The disciples look at this woman and say, "Why this waste?" they ask. "This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor." I want you to pay attention to this. I love this. This whole thing. They're outraged because they want to give money to the poor. This makes this scene so much more helpful than it could have been. Because it's not bad things that steal the disciples' delight here. It's not bad things that make them outraged and see it as ugly. It's not that they want to go like blow money in Vegas or go spend money on themselves it's not that they're lusting after bad things here. They want to give money to the poor. They want to reduce suffering. Like this is a good thing, and Jesus is all about it. Over and over and over again through the Gospels, Jesus is about the poor. So I want you to get this. The problem is not that they want to help the poor. The problem is that they have prioritized the poor and helping the poor over worshiping Jesus. So I'm not sure where you're at in your walk with God, or how new you are to this Christianity thing. So maybe the priority of worshiping Jesus sounds odd to you. So let's pull back and just talk priorities for a minute. Priorities in general. You don't have to buy my perspective on worshiping Jesus to know that when we get to priorities, if we're not careful, you may succeed at all the wrong things. And this is, everyone in the world knows this. Movies are made about this. Stories are told about this over and over again. If you're not careful in life, if you don't order your priorities correctly, you might prioritize your career over your kids, and then you might succeed at that. You might prioritize your body over your soul and end up sexy and miserable. Like, you get it. Like, things have to be prioritized. You have to have a sense of order to your priorities. We all know that if we want to live a good life, then our priorities have to be ordered. The question is, how are you going to order them? Like, what scale, what standard are you going to use to decide this is most important, this is next, this is next, this is next? How are you going to order that? So when you have the decision this week, do I go on yet another phone call to help move forward my career? Or do I go past the football with my son? Or do I go on a walk with my wife? Or do I flip on the TV? Or do I scroll on social media? Or do I go out with my friends? Like, how do you even make that decision? Like, how should we order our priorities? So, famously, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says to a bunch of poor people, bunch of peasants, he says, don't worry about what you eat and what you drink and what you wear. Like, people who don't know God, they worry about those things. Don't let the mere necessities of life decide the order of your priorities. Life is much, much bigger than those basic necessities, he says. But, and I quote, Matthew chapter 6, verse 33, "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." That if you seek God and his values and his perspective and his life, if we seek that first, if we seek him first, if we order our lives around his kingdom and around him, then everything else will fall in line. Now, you do not have to believe in God to appreciate like the internal logic of this. If God is the most important thing in the universe, if he's the author of life, if he's the source of all of our joy, ultimately, the source of goodness and beauty, the one for whom you exist, then it only makes sense. It is logical that we should order our lives in line with him if we believe that. And I know most of us do. So, according to Jesus, and according to the logic of anyone who's a theist, when we get this right, when we get our priorities right where we put God first, then everything else will fall in line. And when we get this wrong, everything else will start to fall out of line. So let me be clear, when we talk about priorities here, I'm not saying that if you put your career first, or if you put serving the poor people first, or if you put whatever, I'm not saying that you'll be terrible or evil or unsuccessful. You might be extremely successful. You might do lots of good things. You might help eradicate poverty. Wouldn't that be a great thing? I'm not saying that you can't be successful in those things, but I am saying, and more importantly, Jesus is saying, that if you make anything other than God your top priority, then you're setting yourself up for failure. If you make anything other than God your top priority, you're setting yourself up to not find delight. Why? The first reason is this, because everything in life, Jesus says this later in the Sermon on the Mount, everything else in life can fail, can be taken away, can be stolen, can be lost. So if you set your top priority as yourself, you can fail. If it's your marriage, if it's your kids, if it's your stuff, if it's your career, all of that stuff can collapse. And this pandemic shows that a lot of that has collapsed. Anything else you lean your life against, it's too fragile, too fickle, too weak. God alone is the rock. God alone is able to support the immense weight of your hopes, your dreams, and yes, your delight. The second reason is this: nothing else in life, not only will God not fail, nothing else in life will truly satisfy. Those things, marriage, career, kids, health, they cannot give you the delight you're looking for. I'm not saying that they're not good things. I'm not saying that you can't find delight in them, but I'm saying if you bring your deepest delight to them, in the words of Jeremiah, they are a broken cistern. They can't quench your thirst. They just can't hold it. When you chase after these things, thinking that they'll satisfy your deepest desires, you are going to be disappointing. You're going to run into that glass wall just like the walleye did. In the words of David, those who run after other gods, that's what it is. Anything that you make most important in your life, anything that you put other than God as the most important thing, they will suffer more and more. In the words of Jonah, those who cling to worthless idols, those who say this is the most important thing in my life and something other than God, they turn away from God's love for them. You're giving up on the most important thing in life, to know God's love. So the first wall that we talked about is about your perspective. The second one is our priorities. If our priorities get out of order, we can fail even when we succeed. So here's the question for this one. What's your number one priority in life? Like, not what do you say is your number one priority, not what do you tell people is your number one priority. But if you look at your life, if you hired an outside auditor who could actually not only go through your whole life in your checkbook and your emails and your web browser, but could actually go through your heart and examine your heart, what's most important to you? If you woke up tomorrow then, and you were to truly make God your number one priority, what would change? What would you feel, do, think differently? Two ways to think about it. Our priorities. The first thing is our perspective. It can ruin, it can shrink, it can change our focus and ruin our ability to find delight and beauty in the very thing that's right in front of us. The second is our priorities. And the third is probably the hardest to nail down and arguably the most important thing we need to talk about. And it's other people. So I want you to imagine the scene. You come into the room, and Jesus is laying there. And this woman comes in. She breaks open this jar out of love, out of great sacrifice. She pours it on Jesus' head. And then they criticize her and scold her and become indignant. They're outraged. They're mad at her. How do you think she felt? Delight and vulnerability go hand in hand. In order to experience the depth of beauty and goodness in a sunset, or in something you made, or in worshiping, or in another person, you have to be open. You have to be vulnerable. Delight and vulnerability go hand in hand. So this summer, I read a book by a guy named Chip Dodd, psychologist out of Texas, Christian guy, worth looking up. And he describes that that usually early in life, but at some point in your life, what happens is we become vulnerable. We delight in things. We delight in others. You'll notice that delight comes much more naturally to children than it comes to adults. So you delight in something. You find something wonderful. You experience it. You give yourself to it. You're vulnerable to it. And then other people come into your life. Parents, siblings, co-workers, teachers, friends, coaches, whoever. And they hurt us. And quite naturally, in that moment, when someone scolds us, when they yell at us, we open up our hearts and we experience this delight, and then they crush us and they hurt us, quite naturally, we pull back into ourselves. We numb our feelings, we drown our desires, we stifle the urge to delight, we stop opening up. And so that, Chip Dodd says, by adulthood, many of us have developed what he calls a habit of practicing hopelessness. Practicing hopelessness. That phrase just stuck out to me. That we don't want to hope anymore. We don't want to chase after the minnows. We know it hurts too much. We know it's too dangerous. We know that every time we open ourselves up to delight, that someone's going to whack us again and again and again. So we'll sit here and we will starve to death for love, connection, intimacy, worship, delight, while beauty and goodness swim all around us. And we won't do a thing. We will practice hopelessness. And that's invisible wall number 3, other people. When we seek delight, other people hurt us, so we train ourselves to give up. If you want to experience a life worth living, you have to go there. You have to deal with this. You have to become vulnerable again. You have to find a safe place to open up. You have to look at how other people have hurt you and shaped your response to life, to God, to everything. You have to do that. And yes, let me be honest. Yes, there will be pain, but there will also be healing. There can also be forgiveness. There can also be a new wholeness. And then finally, there can be delight again. So that's the 3 things. The 3 invisible walls I wanted to talk about today: perspective, priorities, other people. Here's the question: which one is God prompting you to dig into for his glory and your delight? Like, which one does God actually want you to pick up and do something with this week? Like, which one is for you? Here's your assignment for the week. Here's your assignment, and I want you to take this seriously. Last week it was Zephaniah 3:17. I wanted you to chew on that God delights in you. He rejoices over you. This week takes it one step further. This week I want you to talk to Jesus about those invisible walls in your life. What are the things that are holding back your delight? But specifically, I want you to do it in a certain way. I want you to do it in this room, Matthew 26 room, with Jesus. So I want you this week to take time, maybe 15, 20 minutes, and I want you to put yourself in that place. Go someplace where you won't be disturbed, and I want you to enter into that room. Like, if you could somehow go back in time and picture yourself entering in that Thursday into Simon the leper's house, and you slip into the back of the room, and you can smell the air. It's Passover. They're preparing for it, so there's smell of bread and cooking lamb in the background, and there's noise because there's 12 men around a table, and the disciples are reclining. There at the head of the table is Jesus reclining. And then while you're watching from the edge, you see this woman come in, filled with love. And out of great personal sacrifice, she comes in, and she breaks open this perfume, and she pours it over Jesus' head. And you know better than anyone else in the room. You know what no one else in the room knows. You know that she's preparing him for his burial. You know that in a matter of hours he is going to be betrayed, that his back is going to be ripped apart with the cat of 9 tails, that a crown of thorns is going to be pressed into his head, that he is going to be rejected. You know that he's going to die for you. And now in that room, I want you to have the conversation with Jesus. Jesus, what invisible walls are holding me back from experiencing the beauty that's around me, from experiencing you? What do you want to talk about in my perspectives, my priorities, and other people? All right, do that, and we'll pick up this conversation next week. Miss you. See you then.